As Lev Manovich argues, human life in the Western world is increasingly mediated by digital computational interfaces. Computers, laptops, tablet PCs, mobile phones, video games, and many other devices operate as the medium through which a variety of activities are undertaken. In a general sense, as Alexander Galloway suggests, the term interface refers to a surface or point of contact between two entities. These can be between a human being and a technical object, in the case of a tool, or between two technical objects, in the case of software. As such, an interface can be a flint tool, as much as a graphical user interface on a personal computer or a key on a keyboard. So, rather than considering interfaces materially as sets of hardware or software, or considering the content of interfaces as images or representations, I argue, and this is what I argue in the interface envelope, that we can helpfully understand all interface objects, whether those be screens or cables or control pads or images displayed on the screen, as equally objects. So inspired by the work of Ian Bogos, by object I mean a unit that cannot necessarily be reduced to its relations with other things. In Bogos' words, quote, "Things are independent from their constituent parts or remaining dependent on them." An object is thus a weird structure that might refer to a middle-sized object such as a toaster, as much as it might describe an enormous amorphous object like transport logistics, end quote. So for example, an iPhone appears as a single object to a human being who uses it, but it is also composed of multiple other objects that are present but not apparent to that user, such as the graphical processor or the hard drive. At the same time, components of the iPhone, such as its battery, also only encounters the iPhone as a single object, albeit a very different one. Rather than a tool used to access the internet or engage with apps, the battery encounters the iPhone through the interface of the power converter that consumes its stored energy. In this way, objects are both one and many at the same time, appearing in different ways as different things, depending on what or who encounters that thing. So with this account of object in mind, I want to argue that each object that makes up interfaces has what I term a technicity and a resolution that in turn shapes how space and time appear within that interface. These technicities and resolutions are not innocent, I argue, but are actively constructed by interface designers, although of course they don't use this language, in order to attempt to create what I call spatiotemporal envelopes. So for now, envelopes can be defined as localized foldings of space-time that work to shape human capacities to sense space and time for the explicit purpose of creating economic value for the designers and creators of these interfaces. So through examining a number of contemporary video games, I argue that creating economic value in this way can be understood as a new form of power, which I term envelope power. So the concepts of envelopes and envelope power can be understood in the context of emerging claims around how interfaces operate as the site of new economies and forms of power. Writers such as Bernard Stiegler, Catherine Hales, Douglas Rushkoff argue that the content presented through digital interfaces, such as television, video games, and social media, are creating a form of distracted present, in which human capacities for imagination, long-term thinking, and careful reflection are being broken down as part of what Stiegler terms an attention economy, the explicit aim of which is the manipulation of perception in order to create economic value. In the case of video game interfaces, positive affect and attention have economic value that designers attempt to generate to keep players engaged with the game and willing to consume further iterations of that game in the future. However, it is not straightforwardly the case that these industries work to create what Rushkoff calls a perpetual now state in order to create profit. The techniques utilized in video game and interface design attempt to modulate players' capacities for recollection and anticipation, this is my argument, within envelopes of differing length. In this way, interfaces can be understood as potentially generating a continuously modulating now, in which the ability to reflect on the past and anticipate the future are opened and closed in ways that are specific to this or that envelope. And I term this an active form of modulation, precisely envelope power. So envelope power is influenced by, but distinct from what Bernard Stiegler terms psychopower, the specific capacity of media technologies to capture and hold attention, and what Warren Needich refers to as neuropower, the construction of synaptic and habitual relations in the body and brain in order to influence consumer decision making. In contrast, envelope power has the capacity of interfaces to organize the relationship between our memory and anticipation through the production of these localized foldings of space-time in order to produce this kind of economic value. So, therefore, video games are a useful site to theorize these so-called interface envelopes because they are at the forefront of interface development with a variety of interfaces from the Wii nunchucks to the DualShock 4 control pad, offering a variety of different interface experiences. To be clear, not all video game interfaces or interfaces in general produce these so-called envelopes. Rather, envelopes are an ideal goal of interface designers that emerge when the resolution and technicity of objects in interface environments are successfully designed to encourage a deep form of engagement with or from the player. However, it is my claim that all interfaces can be understood as sets of objects, each which have their own technicity and resolution. So, to make sense of these claims, in the rest of the talk, I want to define and demonstrate how objects in interfaces can be understood to have this resolution and technicity, how designers modulate the resolution and technicity of objects to potentially create envelopes, and how these logics of object design in interfaces are perhaps spreading to other non-game forms of interface. So, firstly, all objects in interface environments have a resolution. Now, resolution means three things. Firstly, resolution refers to the ability to determine what an object is and what it does through the way in which the object communicates particular qualities to the player's senses. Following an optical definition of resolution, the denser the amount of information that can be communicated to those senses by an object, the higher the resolution. Secondly, resolution refers to the ability for the player to control an object in a game through fine forms of sensory motor discrimination, which are enabled by different densities of communicated qualities. In this case, an object with low resolution would appear indeterminate, and the player would be unsure of how to control or relate to that object. If an object in the game was of high resolution, then it would appear more determinate to the player. The player would feel as if the object had particular fixed properties, even though, of course, those properties were actually stable or durable qualities that are communicated through an encounter with the interface. An object with high resolution would also allow the player to develop a high degree of confidence in controlling the object with accuracy and speed. As such, the resolution of objects in video games have multiple qualities that consist of visual, audio, and haptic information, which resonate through the body and contribute to whether the object is experienced at high or low resolution. So, thirdly, resolution refers to the extent to which an object appears homeostatic from other objects in an interface environment. Now, homeostasis can be defined very simply as a state of relative stability in which the parts of an object that make up a particular system, whether that be a single organism, a population of organisms, or a technical object, tend towards equilibrium. So, in relation to objects in interface environments, homeostasis refers to giving objects the appearance of a functional autonomy that is both linked to and separate from other objects in the interface environment. So, constructing and modulating the resolution of objects in an interface environment can be understood as a form of neuropower. So for Warren Needich, neuropower can be defined as a process of shaping synaptic relations in the brain in order to prime consumers' thought and decision-making processes in ways that are beneficial to the companies that are working to shape those processes or relations. So Nedich's account itself develops Lazaratu's theory of neuropolitics, understood as, quote, the ensemble of techniques of control that are exercised in the brain. It involves, above all, attention and is aimed at the control of memory and its virtual power, end quote. So, while neuropolitics examines how attention is manipulated through present events, neuropower focuses on how objects and events remap the brain, as kind of Nietzsche puts it, over longer temporalities. So what does that mean? That was all quite a lot of kind of jargon there. So designers can modulate the resolution of objects and interfaces to create neuropower. How do they do that? Well, what am I talking about? Take, for example, the design of weapons in popular video games such as Battlefield 3. In first-person shooting games such as Battlefield 3, the weapon the avatar holds forms the main way in which the player can relate to the interface. The resolution of a weapon in the game Battlefield 3, for example, can be understood as the qualities it discloses as the player engages with it, including the way the weapon is modeled and animated, the way the weapon sounds, and the way the weapon provides haptic feedback through the control pad. So in Battlefield 3, weapons are based upon approximations of real-world weapons, such as the M16 assault rifle, L968 sniper rifle, and so on and so forth. In turn, the reload animations for each weapon mirror the weapon they are based upon, creating the appearance that each weapon is composed of individual parts that function mechanically in relation to one another, and that each round a player fires, for example, corresponds to an actual round in the weapon's magazine. In gameplay, this is expressed in a number of ways. For example, through the way the reload animation is context-specific to whether the magazine has any ammunition in it when the player presses the reload button on the control pad. If there is still ammunition in the weapon, the animation will show the previous magazine being ejected and a new one inserted, after which the weapon is ready to fire. If there are no rounds left in the weapon, the animation will show the new magazine being inserted, followed by an animation of the avatar's hand pulling a new round into the weapon's chamber, thus making it ready to fire. So while seemingly just visual, these two animations also take different lengths of time and therefore directly feed back into the gameplay experience and the decision-making processes of the player. For instance, skilled players may reload when there are still rounds in the magazine to avoid the increased time it takes to reload from empty, which would make them vulnerable from enemy fire in the meantime. So how weapons are animated in Battlefield is a simple way to make them appear as these distinct autonomous units, but also serves to generate Neuro power by connecting the animation of the weapons to the embodied and synesthetic experience of the player as they make strategic decisions about when and how to reload based upon how many rounds the weapon has in its magazine and the length of time it takes to reload. So building high-resolution objects allows designers to generate Neuro power by creating strong synaptic connections between body, brain, and interface, and in turn, positive affects, which encourage the player to keep playing and engaging with the interface. So, as well as a resolution, objects and interfaces also have a technicity. Technicity refers to the capacity for technology to give humans an orientation in time. So specifically, technicity can be defined by drawing upon Bernard Stiegler's reading of Heidegger's work as a, quote, durable fixing of the now, end quote. While Stiegler does not define technicity in this way, I argue we can co-opt his reading of Heidegger to suggest that technicity means technology shapes how the now, as a phenomenological experience, emerges from a relationship between the memory of a past and the anticipation of a future, which is related to a particular activity or encounter between objects. As such, from this perspective, the now of perception is not simply there or apparent to us, but only appears to us as humans through the sets of equipment and technology which make up the ecology of our environments. In other words, clocks, timetables, hammers, and so on implicitly create an experience of the present and a way of relating past memory to future experience. And I would argue maybe this is implicit in Heidegger's account of temporality in practice. For example, in swinging a hammer to hit a nail, the user must be aware of why he or she is performing that action, perhaps to hang a picture on the wall. This obviously implies a future outside of present experience. At the same time, the ability to swing the hammer relies upon some kind of past experience or memory, even if that's some kind of somatic memory. And so Stiegler terms this kind of consciousness creative anticipation. Quote, anticipation means the realization of a possibility not determined by a biological program, end quote. In this way, the experience of a present or now of perception is constructed from this so-called equipmental structure, through both the anticipation required to put this structure to use and the memory, both kind of somatic, cognitive, and so on, to fulfill the actual task at hand. So as complex forms of interface device, video games generate multiple temporalities as various software, middleware, and hardware objects interact and relate to one another. All of these processes in turn shape the technicity that emerges when a player picks up the control pad and actually begins to play the game. So how the technicity of technical objects and interface design sets the temporal limits around which a now appears is not an innocent process. Rather, it is highly mediated, political, and contested. In this regard, shaping how the now appears can be understood as a form of psychopower. So Stiegler defines psychopower as, quote, the systematic organization of the capture of attention made possible by the psychotechnologies that were developed with the radio, the television, and with digital technologies spreading all over the planet, end quote. So for Stiegler, attention, which is the key currency of psychopower, is defined as the capturing of primary retentions, or present perceptions, and secondary retentions, or kind of subjective and somatic memory, in order to shape how individuals anticipate what is to come next. So Stiegler argues that media industries work to capture attention by creating tertiary retentions or exteriorized forms of memory, such as images, sounds, text, and so on, which then form the primary, the perception, and the secondary, the subjective memory, retentions of viewers. As such, psychopower is not simply about capturing or holding our attention, but actively modulating attention within a set of perceptual limits organized around our capacity to anticipate and remember. It's kind of both ways, rather than just all about memory. So, to understand how the technicity of objects and interfaces operate to create psychopower, we can turn to an example from the Call of Duty series, which is part of a very popular military-themed first-person shooting series of games. So, a key technique designers use to shape the technicity of the weapons in the game, and of course they don't call it the technicity, right, and thus construct psychopower, is the use of what they call aim-assist technology. So within the game, there's kind of an aim-assist functionality which is automatically enabled, which most players aren't really aware of. And what that does is it slows the movement of the player's weapon as the aiming reticules, these 4 little dots there, pass over an enemy avatar. Now, the reticules slow down in order to give the player a greater opportunity to aim and fire at the target. The aim assist system was implemented in the console versions of Call of Duty because of the difficulty of aiming accurately using the quite short and stubby analog sticks on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 control pads. And the level of slowdown enabled by the aim assist technology is commonly referred to by kind of players that play the game a lot and understand these systems as the stickiness of the weapon, a term that refers to the feeling that the enemy player is coated in kind of an invisible adhesive which the weapon reticules cling to as they move through the hitbox of the player. The hitbox is just the kind of area where a hit is registered if you fire at them. So one could argue that the aim assist technology in the modern warfare engine operates to shape the temporal ecstasis of player action, albeit in a very micro and minor way. Turning the weapon to aim at an enemy, the auto-aim slows the weapon's movement as it passes over the enemy target. Through this process of slowing down, time is spatialized and fixed through differences in speed. The now is opened up by the slowing down of time through a process of spatial delay, in which the weapon travels more slowly through the opponent's hitbox. In doing so, the auto-aim serves to open the temporal window at which a player can hit their target. The auto-aim system therefore serves to minimize the level of anticipation required to respond to the aiming event by lengthening the now point in which a vital decision about whether to fire and how to fire is to be made. So by opening the temporality of a decision-making event, the auto-aim system is designed to offer the player literally more time to react. So why do they do this? What's the point of this kind of complex technique? Well, I would argue that designers have attempted to kind of open up the now for beginners as a way to cultivate and encourage their capacity to sense difference when they have little skill with that game or interface. This is important because when they're initially learning to play against online human opponents, the player is most likely to lose repeatedly, and so their potential to stop playing, experience negative affects, is much, much higher. By introducing this very subtle auto-aim feature, which, like I say, most players don't even realize exists or is part of the game, game designers can attempt to mitigate against negative affective states such as frustration or anger that may quickly build when beginning to play online, and importantly, thus maintain a player's engagement, maintain a player's attention. So zooming out from the kind of minutiae of particular objects and interface systems, we can consider the cumulative effects objects have when they're assembled together. Indeed, my main contention here is that when successfully assembled together, these sets of objects in this interface environment, each with their own kind of technicities and resolutions, have a potential power that is greater than the sum of the neuropower or psychopower of their individual parts. And I term this phenomena that emerges from a successfully assembled interface environment, and you have to remember, not all games can do this very well. It's very hard to cultivate a kind of an environment full of objects which have kind of finely tuned technicities and resolutions. I term these types of power these environments generate, if successful, envelope power. So an interface envelope can be understood as the emergent effect of a series of objects in an environment. Here, an envelope we shouldn't think about envelope as a kind of form of covering or protection to immunize the user from its surrounding conditions, as in a kind of paper envelope, or in Bruno Latour's reading of Sloterdijk, a spacesuit, but rather to open up the very possibility for experiencing an environment at all. An interface envelope can be defined as a localized opening of space-time, or emergent effect of the continuous interaction between a player's body and the technicity and resolution of objects they engage with when they use an interface system. Interface envelopes, thus, are not composed of particular forms of kind of solid, liquid, or gas, but you could argue them to be kind of homeomorphic forms of space and time. And interface envelopes are homeomorphic in the sense that they actively kind of bend, modulate, and shift within a kind of series of limits as the player engages with different objects that make up the interface environment. And in many ways, when they're successfully constructed, this allows them to accommodate and respond to what a player is doing when they're engaging with that interface. So in doing so, the interface envelope can attempt to organize the habitual relations between the player's body and brain and their temporal perception. And I have to say, attempt. Yeah, this is very difficult and it's not often fully successful. The process of modulating the technicity and resolution of objects in an environment to produce an envelope can be examined through a number of cases. Take, for example, the battle system of the very popular role-playing game Final Fantasy XIII. By constructing and placing objects alongside one another, encouraging the player to engage with these objects, I would suggest an envelopment can emerge. The envelope produced by Final Fantasy XIII is an envelopment in which space and time appear and are orientated around the immediacy of player action. Now, this is all intended to keep the player interested and concerned with what is happening within that battle. So, for example, the player, when they're playing, has to wait for a so-called active time battle gauge to fill, which determines when a player can attack. And you could argue that that battle gauge has its own kind of technicity, because it takes like 5 seconds or so to fill, and it in turn shapes temporal action around this kind of 5 to 6 second loop. In turn, the visual depiction of damage points around enemies creates a high resolution, perhaps, by spacing out the damage and creating affective and intensive experiences of representations of damage. And I would just say, all I would say about this, I haven't got time to talk about it in any detail, but these numbers being presented here, they're not presented to allow the player to kind of calculate how much damage they've actually caused. They're there to create a kind of affective sense of kind of damage being done, I guess. So as a player flicks their eyes between the ATB gauge and the damage numbers on the screen, the relationship between here and there, then and now, becomes folded into one another. So in doing so, space and time, I would suggest, become tightened and loosened as the technicity and resolution of objects shift within the interface envelope. Waiting for the ATB gauge to fill and then having your attention drawn away by the resolution of damage markers on the screen fills the space in between objects, pulling space together. As the camera pulls back and pans automatically around the ongoing battle, space and time loosen a little, offering the player a sense of an environment beyond the immediacy of the battle. At the same time, players are switching between various roles in order to gain some tactical advantage over their enemy. At any one moment, then, a number of qualities are emerging from the relations between objects, which results in the player being affected on a number of different levels and having to differentiate between a variety of objects and processes within different temporal windows. So when envelopes are generated successfully, I would suggest they produce a form of power that can be termed envelope power, which is distinct from either neuro power or psycho power, even if it is shaped by them, and even if it kind of emerges from them. Envelope power differs from neuro power and psycho power in three main ways, two of which, for reasons of time, I will discuss now. So firstly, I would suggest that envelope power is more dynamic and amorphous than either neuropower or psychopower. Envelope power is homeomorphic, which is to say that envelopes are shifting localizations of space-time that emerge from the active relationship between bodies and objects that make up the interface environment. Whereas Stiegler, I would argue, ultimately sees psychopower as about manipulating attention and memory by divorcing the present from a broader sequence of past and future now points. In contrast, envelope power works to modulate the limits around which the past and future appear as modes of potential. The present now is not cut off from some abstract past or future now, but is productively linked to particular pasts or futures that the designers kind of want to push the player towards or away from. Secondly, envelope power does not simply diminish capacities for attention and the ensuing forms of cognition this attention allows. And again, I think this is where this differs from Stiegler especially. Instead, envelope power actively cultivates the generation of new capacities to act. It's generative. It produces new capacities. It doesn't just dull or take away existing capacities. Different from neuropower or psychopower, envelope power is not about creating addictive, passive, or unthinking bodies. Instead, envelope power can be defined productively in two ways. First, envelope power works to increase users' habitual and embodied capacities to sense difference and modulate these capacities to encourage both automatic and reflexive modes of response. Secondly, envelope power draws upon players' habitual capacities to sense difference, to alter the relationship between their temporal anticipation and recollection, in order to encourage continued engagement with the consumption of the products they are using. So to conclude then, I would like to suggest that these logics of interface design that I've been discussing are not restricted to the video games, but are potentially spreading to other forms and types of interface, which also have the potential to produce envelopes. For example, think of the development of augmented reality applications and devices, such as Google Glass, or apps on iPhones, such as Locator and Theodolite, where tertiary retentions are exteriorized and spatialized in a dynamic way onto the environment. Rather than a fixed point of a map that provides a static overview of a space, markers that denote the location of Wi-Fi hotspots, for example, become seemingly fixed onto the objects in the world themselves. So by fixing information onto objects, these interfaces attempt to narrow the gap between representation and object, but in doing so also push users' perception into a narrowly defined present tense. Using apps such as Theodolite or Locator can focus attention on the now and the perceptual present of exploration as the interface dynamically responds to the device's spatial positioning and coordinates. These apps potentially shortcut the relationship between tertiary and secondary retention by creating and presenting tertiary retentions, those exteriorized memories into the environment that stand in or replace the need for secondary retention from a subjective memory. Having markers placed in the field of view means that users have less requirement to rely upon their subjective memories. At the same time, the heads-up display interface minimizes the requirement for the users to anticipate or project their thoughts too far into the future towards the next potential decision point, because the interface can constantly adjust to the user's position in space. So, although currently the outcome of particularly intense game experiences, one could argue that more and more types of interface are designed to attempt to produce envelopes. In doing so, the perpetual now they attempt to create could become a more widespread, banal, and diffuse phenomena that shape practices and relations in everyday life outside of games. The extent to which this might occur is yet to be seen, but today, hopefully, I provided a conceptual vocabulary and mode of analysis, to begin to think through these processes, both within and outside of game interfaces. Thank you.